Hello. Okay, as promised, here is kind of my take on the Lex Fridman and Volodymyr Zelenskyy, President Zelenskyy interview. I'm not going to do the whole 3-hour thing again. It was painful enough to watch once, and I'm not going to suffer through it again and do a play-by-play. So I'm just going to give you my synopsis. First and foremost, it's a damn boring interview, as I kind of thought it would be. I've seen him interview other people before, and it's just what others kind of take as his slow, methodical, thoughtful, I find as just being dead behind the eyes and not connecting with his interview subject in any meaningful manner. Yeah, they have a little bit of a repartee and a little back and forth, but he does not seem connected to his interview subjects. And it's not just this thing with Zelenskyy. The other thing about it, as I had anticipated and why I was kind of reluctant to watch it in the first place, all of it is done through the prism of Moscow's perspective, which is a very complex thing to discern and to describe unless you spend a lot of time physically in this part of the world. And how their value system, their culture, their perspective on human interaction, a lot of it is fundamentally different than what we foster in the West, for better or worse. The Russians will say we're a bunch of hypocrites, and at the end of the day, we're just as brutal as they are. But Lex clearly, despite having said I've read tons of books, well, you didn't absorb the meaning of it. Maybe not, not even in terms of kind of the historical dialectic, because it isn't just about the printed word. It's understanding what the history means to those who are living here now. That the trauma of generational pain inflicted upon this country by Moscow, and that doesn't just, and that's not just here in Ukraine. That's throughout anywhere that Moscow reaches out to. It's a brutal system, a binary system. Somebody always wins, somebody always loses, and somebody is always the winner. Somebody is always the dominant. Somebody else is always subjugated. And Lex, I don't think, having lived for so long in the United States, understands what that truly means. So just going from that to begin with made this thing just rubbish, in my opinion. The whole, now to start with, before we even go into the substance, there's also the language issue to be discussed. Of course, Zelenskyy is going to speak primarily in Ukrainian. At the beginning of this war, it wasn't quite like that. It is now. Speaking Russian is becoming less and less, I don't want to say accepted, but less and less something that Ukrainians will do because it is the language of the occupier. And the whole gamesmanship about it. I mean, Zelenskyy speaks perfect English. They could have done it in English as well. And, they flip between all the different languages all throughout the entire thing. And I mean, at no point does anybody mention the fact that actually Zelenskyy's native language, coming from a town called Kryvyi Rog, was first Russian. He spoke Russian first. And then again, going to Fridman's complete lack of understanding of the conflict and what this conflict has meant to this country, and who is the straight up aggressor, and who is being invaded, who are the invaders, what does this mean psychologically to the people of this country, and physically to the people of this country, and everything else that has happened in the last certainly 3 years, but since 2014 as well. His whole thing about throughout the interview of like, oh, I just have this dream and when this peace needs to be made and oh, spare me your frickin' crocodile tears. You don't know what war is like. You haven't got a clue what it's like to live in a war. We all want peace. I want to go home, all right? But I'm going to stick this out for reasons that my audience knows. But also, in addition to that, every Ukrainian in this country wants peace. Oh, your bleeding heart, like, let's just stop the shooting and everything will be okay. It's patronizing. It is absolutely, like Ukrainians don't want peace. What? That was insulting throughout the entire thing. I have a dream that we'll have peace, Yeah, sure, peace, but a just peace. Why is... and he has this subtext throughout the entire damn thing of, well, Putin wants peace, I'm sure. And of course, Donald Trump wants peace. So ergo, you're the obstruction. Why can't you just accept peace? The president of the country that was invaded, who has been suffering horribly for over a decade. And it's gone at from a point of if only you would just agree to something, then the war would end. Where's Putin's responsibility in this? And for that matter, where's the West? America and Trump included. Where's their role in obtaining a just peace for a country that has been savagely attacked and will be dealing with the consequences of this war for a very, very long time, not least of which also the occupation of this country through the centuries. He also displays this ignorance of how things are done. He keeps going back to this idea of, if you'll just sit down with, Putin and Trump and you just sit down in a room, in a smoke-filled room, and nobody else, in the room where it happens. Yeah, and yes, obviously, there are pivotal moments in history where that has been the case. But what also is the case is that a lot of times, and I am convinced that in this case it will be like this whenever true peace negotiations begin or ceasefire negotiations begin, it won't just be three guys sitting around in a room behind closed doors carving things up. Not to mention Lex is excluding the Europeans, which I'm sure Brussels isn't going to be too fond of, much less London. But it's not – this is the cynical worldview of Putin that I think a lot of people who are kind of fellow travelers, and we see it in the MAGA movement as well, of like things don't happen organically or with effort. They happen by power dynamics, by people behind curtains, behind closed doors. Not to say – again, that is not – to say that never happens. Of course that happens. But then teams of diplomats sit down and they hash this stuff up. They crunch numbers. They scrutinize lines. They discuss all kinds of strata. I mean, what about compensation? That never comes up in the entire interview, by the way. They talk about all range of issues that might be obstacles to peace, but they never talk about compensation. Moscow has destroyed so much of this country. There needs to be a financial burden on the Russian Federation to undo the damage that they've done. And I'm talking about dollars and cents. I'm talking about a price tag for what it is that they have done. Not a word. Not a word, just this dreamy idea that three guys will sit alone in a room and figure it all out. And then it comes up, the Budapest agreement comes up, which is kind of, I guess, linked to this idea of diplomacy and Zelensky's obvious anger at how betrayed many Ukrainians feel about Budapest. I mean, think about this. Why was there even a Budapest summit? Why did that even happen? Sure, it was about the nukes. But it was also from a Ukrainian perspective of why should we give up these nukes? Because we know Moscow, we know the Russian Empire, and we know they will come for us. So for us to give up these nukes, there has to be some give and take. There has to be a quid pro quo. And so they were given promises because they knew the kind of neighbor that Moscow is. And what did we do? We just let it drift in the wind. The Budapest agreement is not worth the paper it was written on, and it is in my mind, massive betrayal of these people, despite everything that has been discussed about the Budapest agreement and the language of it and all the rest of it. At the end of the day, for the Ukrainians going to their summit, afraid that once Moscow got back up on its feet, its first target, in a very short list, one of its first targets was going to be Ukraine because it has to have Ukraine for it to be a colony. Vladimir Lenin understood this after the Russian Civil War and the Bolshevik Revolution, that it had to be spread and first and foremost through Ukraine. Why do you think there was a first Ukrainian War of Independence in 1919? They know their enemy better than us. That's why they went to Budapest to sign that agreement, because they wanted assurances from the enemy that they knew, the colonizer, the empire that was eventually going to come with, lust in its heart and, salivating to regain their empire. Ukrainians knew this. That's why they signed that agreement. And I can understand completely Zelensky's anger at the abandonment of it. So then we come to this point where Fridman says he believes that Putin loves his country. And don't you think he loves his country? No. And I'm with Zelenskyy on this. No, he doesn't love his country. He doesn't love his countrymen. He doesn't love his people. He might believe in the power of Russia and the glory of Russian empire, but he doesn't love his people. You don't ascend to power in the Kremlin by blowing up people in apartment buildings in 1999 to obtain that power. That's not love. That's dominance. That's ascension to power. I was in Moscow in 1999. I saw it, if he loved his people, then why is it we're seeing a resumption of the traditional, if the Tsar only knew, messages to the Kremlin now being done by video? Why doesn't he answer those? All those pleas for we don't have electricity, or we don't have heating in sub-zero temperatures, or our roads are a disgrace, or our country is falling apart, or we don't have homes that were promised to us in Mariupol. If he loved his people, wouldn't he answer those messages? No, like the traditional letters to the Tsar during that time of if the Tsar only knew, they went into the fire, or into the rubbish bin immediately. This is not the power dynamic of Russian society. It never has been. It's not as simplistic as I am making it sound, but at the end of the day, that's what it is. The power elite don't give a damn about the people of Russia. They never have. There's a very thin strata of power upon which the Tsar sits, and then there's everybody else. And it's one of the main reforms that they need to do, and they know it, and they just refuse to do it. Another threat that a successful Ukraine poses to the power elite in Russia, because if it can be done here, many Russians are going to wonder why it can't be done there. As far as Russian and Ukrainian reconciliation, which is brought up in the interview, no. I know there are many mixed families. I know many Ukrainians who want to reconnect with their Russian families because there is cross-border family relations, friendships, and all the rest of it. But I understand the hatred that has grown within Ukraine, not only from the damage that many Russians and the death and destruction that they turn a blind eye to, but also because I am very well aware that many Ukrainians, when this war began, reached out to their Russian connections, to their Russian, extended families and friends and what have you, and pleaded with them to do something, if only to, stage some protest or voice their concerns. And those Russians, by and large, turned their back on the Ukrainian connections, the people here. So of course there's growing anger and resentment and downright hatred. And it's going to take a long time before that is resolved. Look at the Irish and the English. If you've ever traveled to Ireland with an Irish friend, you instantly see the difference in how you are treated, especially as an American, I suppose. But regardless, and that was a far less devastating and difficult divorce between empire and colony. Again, Lex just doesn't understand this. He doesn't have a clue. The resentment, the pain, the suffering, not only of this war, but of centuries of oppression. It's just not in his conceptualization of what is happening here. And he doesn't get it. He's an American. He's more American than he is. He claims to be, of Russian and Ukrainian descent. Well, that very well may be, but he is clearly a Westerner and clearly an American, because so much of this is just not something that he groks, that he feels not only in his mind but in his heart and in his deep sense of understanding of the cultural and value differences between Russia and the West. I mean, there's this funny moment, and nobody's picked up on this that I've seen, and other folks' analysis of this, is that there's a moment when Volodymyr Zelenskyy refers to Putin as Uncle Vova, which is incredibly insulting. And dismissive of the president of the Russian Federation to be called kind of this cutesy and diminutive Uncle Vova. But no, Lex, right over his head, doesn't catch it. And then there's this, and then Zelenskyy also does this jab, I guess, about, his language, Russian language skills. He seemed to really be kind of struggling with Russian. And I think that was a distinct jab at Lex that maybe didn't, maybe he just kind of let slide by, or maybe he didn't catch, because I think what Zelenskyy was saying there was, you may kind of speak a comfortable Russian, but you're struggling, and you're also struggling to understand where Russia and Ukraine as a European country, which Russia is not. They like to say so, but only when it suits their purposes. Zelenskyy is, I think, pointing out that Lex is not really in touch with his sense of the Russkaya dusha, or the Russian soul. Then they take a break, they come back, and then he immediately starts Lex does in this entire narrative about like criticisms of Ukraine and what he poses as concerns that Americans and Westerners have about the state of democracy or rule of law or anti-corruption. But it's all, again, seen through a narrative that has been, and these borders and these kind of like through lines that have been created in Moscow, not here in Ukraine. He is seeing this through Moscow's messaging that's been adopted in the West. It's not an understanding of how things are going here. The people here are desperate to fight against corruption. They obviously want democracy. Yes, the elections have been postponed, but that is 100% constitutional. And Lex doesn't even bring up the fact that it wasn't Zelenskyy that imposed martial law. The Rada voted on it. The legislative body. Go back to our episode with Kira Rudik, and when she talks about that moving moment, that session of the Rada where they voted on martial law. And what happens, by the way, this is a point I bring up and which is never discussed, and I wish it would have been, how do the people who are in occupied territories of Ukraine cast their ballot? You think the Russians are going to let them do that? And how then are the ballots collected? It's just... He doesn't understand the complexities of what's happening here. He says he read a bunch of books. He says he comes from, Ukrainian and Russian stock. Well, that's all well and good, but there's clearly a disconnect. You can't just parachute in here. It's the same criticism I had against Tucker Carlson. This is complex. This place is deeply complex. And some of it can't be learned from a book. Some of it has to be lived experience, something Lex clearly doesn't have. And all this issue of many of the faults that exist in Ukrainian society, and not exclusively, they have agency. They're responsible for their own governance and their own situation. But much of why they're fighting this war is because so many of these societal problems are a direct result of having lived under Moscow's thumb for so long. That's not just going to disappear overnight. And he talks about Trump and Musk and tries to get, he asks these questions, what do you think of these guys? What do you think of, and Zelenskyy is of course going to, err on the side of caution. That's the incoming president and one of the most powerful, richest man in the world. He's going to talk smack. And I know it's, then pose the questions differently, or don't ask them at all. It was just, again, a really bad interview. The whole thing was a terrible, terrible interview. And maybe I'm biased because I have been privileged enough in my professional career, such as it was, to watch some really good, skilled professional journalists who knew how to interview people. Fridman is a bad interviewer, folks. Some might like his demeanor and his approach. That's fine. I don't. I think it is anodyne. I think it is it's passionless. There's no human interaction in the sense of real a conversation where he is responding to what the other person is saying and they go off on a tangent. It seemed to me throughout the entire thing that he had a list of questions, and this is a common mistake that people do. He had a list of questions, and he was going to get through that list. And it just went, just methodically and without kind of – it was dull. It was dull, and it was a waste of time. I learned nothing, and I don't think anything new came from it. If there was a benefit to it, and I genuinely hope that this does happen, is if there is an upside to this interview, it is that perhaps a little bit of Ukraine's messaging will find its way into other areas where it's less represented. This is going to be a major issue throughout this year, and that's why we here at On the Edge are going to continue to fight that battle. We cannot solely look at this region or this war through the lens that Moscow provides to the West, and which is, in my opinion, swallowed piecemeal without questioning, because much of the much of the press corps is not here. Much of the press corps that does cover Ukraine, do it from Moscow because that's where they're normally based, or that's where the kind of if you study Ukraine, very rarely do you study Ukraine. You study it as part of the Russian Empire, so you're always coming at it from that perspective. That needs to change. We need to start telling Ukrainian stories through Ukrainian voices. Or people, at the very least, who have extended knowledge of Ukraine, this land, not as some sort of lesser Russia. And that's where I think this interview failed so horribly, and so many other interviews and articles and reports that are coming out of this place or that are done in London or New York to an audience that should be learning more about what it is to be Ukrainian, who are these people, why they're fighting so hard, what this country's about, what their aspirations are, what they're trying to get away from Moscow's dominion, why that is. And they're not getting it. So if there is a good thing to have come out of this interview, this long, boring interview, perhaps it will be that the occasional snippet of some of the great things that Zelenskyy said, and I have to commend him. He was very patient with some very stupid questions, and he also articulated his position quite well. So I'm hoping that people will stop swallowing, the narrative about him as a leader, a human being, but a fantastic leader of this country, in my opinion, and in many other Ukrainians' opinions. So, it was a miserable interview. I watched it, so you don't have to, but that's my response. So.